Well, thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Preparing Your Houseplants for Spring. I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Since we're coming to you virtually, please excuse technical issues, glitches that may pop up throughout today's event. If you experience problems with video or audio, click the reconnect button on your screen to get back to the webinar right away. A quick note, we are recording today's webinar. A replay will be made available on our website by tomorrow. Today, we welcome Caitlin Hastings to our webinar series. Caitlin earned her bachelor's degree from the School of Education with a concentration in exercise science in 2013 and a Master of Science from the School of Health Professions in 2016. She is the founder of Botanica Houseplants Shops and Botanica Plantscaping Consultants. At this time, I would like to welcome Caitlin for today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to today's presentation.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining. I was just telling Greg I could run my mouth all day about houseplants, so I'm so glad that you guys are here. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of educational information just to prepare your plants for spring coming out of winter dormancy. And I'll tell you guys a little bit about myself and what I am doing currently. So I'm actually a graduate of UAB, both undergraduate and graduate programs. I'm a physician assistant in real life by training, but my life has definitely taken a turn for the better, I think, since COVID. I was working as a physician assistant in 2020 and was actually furloughed from my job. I was working at a non-essential clinic at the time. And so I just kind of fell into this houseplant thing, opened a few houseplant shops around Alabama and Tennessee, and very quickly fell in love with it and decided I didn't want to go back to the medical field. So I am a full-time plant lady now, even though I do still have a physician assistant degree and could go back to work if I wanted to. So right now I am doing something called interior scaping or plantscaping. So this is my focus with my business at the moment. So I no longer own any houseplant shops. I got rid of all of those at the end of last year. And now I am focusing on working with small businesses, bars, restaurants, things like that to try to get more plants into their spaces. So I do indoor plant consultations for interior designers, local businesses, places like UAB, anyone that is wanting to bring more greenery into their space. I come in, do a consultation, look at the lighting, let you know what kind of plants are going to work in the space. I can source all of the planters, do the installation, and then I even offer ongoing maintenance where I'm the one that's coming back around to care for these plants, make sure they thrive, make sure your investment is protected, all that jazz. And it's fun for me because I love taking care of my own plants, but I also love taking care of other people's plants. So if you've been to Blue Root to eat lunch, we did their plant wall. Ladybird Taco just opened in Mountain Brook. We did all of their plants. That's a really cool place. Other places we service are Boca downtown, Cayo Coco, Lululemon at the Summit, the Real and Rosemary restaurants around town. So we partner with a lot of different people, love working with small businesses. So that's my whole spiel. If anybody has any plant needs that we can help with, I'm going to put my information up on the last slide of this presentation so you guys can get in touch if you want to. But without further ado, I know you're here to learn about your own houseplants, how to prepare them for spring. So we're going to jump right into that because I don't want to take up too much of your time today. So some things to consider as your plants are coming out of winter dormancy. Winter dormancy is kind of this time in the life cycle of a plant during fall and winter where plants kind of almost go to sleep. You're going to notice in your houseplants, you're not getting a lot of growth during those colder months. Plants are not exerting as much energy because they're not growing during this time. They're kind of just taking a much needed break, and then they're going to start growing again in the spring. So some things to consider as your plants are coming out of winter dormancy as we're coming into the spring when they're going to be growing. Does my plant need to be repotted? You can start fertilizing again if that's something that you like to do. Totally not necessary. And we're going to go over all this stuff more in depth. And then you'll also want to consider increasing your watering frequency again. So in the wintertime, we typically cut back on our watering regimen a good bit, whereas like if you're used to watering your plants once a week, you might cut back to watering every 10 to 14 days. Just again, like I said, because the plants are not exerting as much energy, they're not growing, they don't have all of those nutritional needs in the dormancy period. And so you're going to want to increase your watering frequency again coming out of winter dormancy. So let's dive a little bit more into each of these topics. And I'll take questions at the end. So you guys just be thinking about if you have anything that you want me to go over. All right, so repotting plants. How do I know when it's time to repot my plants? What kind of soil should I use? What size pot do I need? These are questions that everybody has, and I answer these all the time. So I'm going to go over this stuff with you now. So with repotting, there are several indicators to know when your plant is ready to be repotted, and they all look kind of different. So I'm just going to kind of go over some things for you guys to look out for with your own plants. That way you'll kind of know if it's time. Typically, most houseplants are going to want to be repotted every 2 to 4 years or so. If you're noticing a lot of growth, or if you're fertilizing very heavily and they're growing a whole lot over the course of 1 year, it may need to be repotted more often than that. But I've got plants like even this big fiddle leaf fig that's behind me that admittedly has been in the same pot for about 6 years now, and it's starting to get unhappy. So, you know, you'll kind of pick up on some of these things on your own plants, and they'll tell you when they need to be repotted. They really will. So let's run through some of these indications. So if you notice inside of your pot, if you notice that the soil is pulling away from the edges, the rim of the pot over time, that's a good indication that your plant needs to be repotted. You'll also notice that when you go to water the plant, when this happens, like when your soil is pulling away from the edges, you'll notice kind of a gap between the pot and the soil of the plant. And when you water, a lot of this water just runs down in that gap. And so you've got this big root ball, you know, with all the roots of the plant, but none of the water is actually penetrating through. It's just kind of running down the sides because it's all just really compacted. So that's a really good indication that your plant is ready to be repotted in some fresh soil, is if the soil is pulling away from the edges of the pot. Also, if you notice roots growing out of the bottom of your pot like this, this guy is definitely ready to be repotted, okay? So when your roots are coming out of the pot itself, they're just searching for more room. And so that's a really good indication that your plant needs a bigger pot and some more soil. If you have a plant that looks sad and droopy, the leaves are kind of sad and droopy before you water it, and it doesn't perk back up after it's been watered, that's another sign that your plant is ready to be repotted. And this kind of goes back to that compacted soil issue again. The water sometimes is just not able to penetrate all the way through to the roots like it needs to keep the plant happy and healthy, and hydrated. So if you notice that your plant is sad and droopy before you water it, and then you water it and it doesn't perk up after a day or so, go ahead and try repotting it. That would be the next kind of logical thing to do in your, you know, your steps of being a plant parent. So if you have a sad plant that is kind of developing pale colored leaves, or maybe it didn't grow as much last season, maybe you noticed it just didn't really push out any new foliage, again, a good place to start would be going ahead and repotting the plant. Your plant is only going to be as healthy as its root system is, okay? So when in doubt, if you're ever having an issue with a plant, if it's just not happy, or if you're just not really sure what's going on with it, I always recommend taking the plant out of the pot and looking at the roots. You can look to see if there's you know, any bugs or pests or anything like that in the soil. You can look and see if there's root rot, like if your plant's being overwatered, if your roots are just sitting in stagnant water. It happens to the best of us. This is how I learned how not to overwater my plants, was by overwatering them. So the best place to start if you're having an issue with a plant is to look at the root system. Another thing to look out for, again, with that soil being so compacted on plants that need to be repotted, as you're watering, if you notice that water is just sitting on top of the soil and it's not really absorbing down into the root system, that's another sign that your soil is just super, super compacted and needs to be aerated, or just needs to be, you know, your plant needs to be repotted. So all of these things are really good indicators for when to repot your plant, but when in doubt, every 2 to 4 years should be totally fine. What type of soil do I use? So you want to replicate your plant's natural soil the best that you can. So what does this mean? All of the plants that we use as houseplants, they grow out in nature somewhere in the world, okay? Houseplants aren't necessarily cultivated to be grown indoors. We just end up having plants indoors that work in our indoor climate. So these plants are found all around the world in certain parts. So all of these plants naturally grow in the ground in potting soil. And to be happy, we need to replicate that soil in our own home. So I kind of break things down into tropical plants and desert plants just for the ease of things. With tropical plants, you really want to get a good chunky mix going. You can certainly buy like Miracle Grow, soil at Home Depot or Lowe's, just like a commercial bag of soil is totally fine. However, it's typically not going to be chunky enough and well draining enough for your plants to stay happy. So I typically will start with a bag of commercial potting mix, like your Miracle Grow or something like that, and I will just kind of add a few things to it. So perlite is the little white specks that you see in the pictures of those two soils right there. It's actually just volcanic rock that's been heated and blown up like popcorn, basically. So it kind of feels like styrofoam. And it just is like a space saver in your soil. It just kind of helps keep the soil nice and aerated so that roots can get down in there and they can do their thing, and they're not going to get super root bound. It's also not going to retain a lot of moisture, so root rot isn't as big of a problem. So with tropical plants, like I said, I typically start with an indoor potting mix, and I will add some perlite and some bark. In place of bark, a lot of people have been using the coconut husk chips, so just like the outside of a coconut. Coconut has been used a lot with different types of plant amendments and things, because coconuts are sustainable. Rather than just throwing the husk and the coir on the outside of the coconut away, we're actually using that stuff in potting mixes now, which is really nice. So for your tropical plants, start with your basic, like a Miracle Grow or some kind of potting mix. We're going to add some perlite and we're going to add some bark. There's really no rhyme or reason to this like mixed concoction. You can do equal parts of each if you would like. You just want to make sure that it's nice and chunky and aerated, and that when you put that soil in your hand and you grab it and you make a fist, when you open your hand back up, that soil is going to spread out and it's not just going to stay in a clumped up ball in the middle of your hand, is what you want. So that's your tropical mix. For desert plants, we definitely want, again, a well-draining soil, because think about your cacti and your succulents, right? They are used to being in the desert with no water, hardly at all, okay? So they are very drought tolerant. Because of that, if we're potting cacti, succulents, desert plants, we want to make sure that we have a well-draining soil that has a lot of sand and rocky substances like pumice or turfus or something like that in there, just to replicate natural soil. I also mix in some perlite with my desert mix as well. So start with a base potting mix. Again, you can use a little bit less of it for your desert plants and more of that perlite and the rocky substance. So these are just kind of two different little templates that you can kind of create at home, for your tropical plants and your desert plants. But I promise it's not rocket science. You just want a good, chunky, well-draining soil so that your plants don't get root rot. So that's my spiel on soil. Now, what size pot do I need? This is probably the most important part. And I don't think a lot of people think about this, but I'm going to kind of break it down so that this makes the most sense for you guys. In theory, if a lot of people think, oh, I've got this plant, if I just go ahead and put it in a really big pot, I won't have to repot it again for a long time. It's going to have so much room to grow. It'll be fine. That is actually the opposite of what you need to do, and I'll tell you why. So with plants, your nursery pots that your plants come in, the little plastic pots, they're usually going to range anywhere from 2 inches in diameter up to like 14 inches in diameter. So when we're talking about pot sizes with plants, we talk about the inches in diameter across the top of the pot. So if I say a 4-inch plant like this guy, Okay, a 4-inch plant, this just means it is 4 inches in diameter across the top of the pot. Okay, so when we are talking about repotting plants, we only want to go up in pot size 1 to 2 inches in diameter at a time. Okay, so if I'm starting with a 4-inch plant and I'm repotting it, I only want to go up to a 5 or a 6-inch pot. If I've got a 6-inch pot, I only want to go up to a 7 or an 8-inch pot. Okay, you can kind of see in this photo, the bottom of this slide, they started with a 4-inch plant in a 4-inch pot. And then the next slide, they took it up to a 6-inch. And then in the next picture, they took it up to an 8-inch. That's the same plant in an 8-inch pot. You can just see how much smaller it looks because the pot is so big. Okay, so here's what happens if you put a small plant in too big of a pot. That plant, for the majority of its time, is going to spend all of its energy establishing a deeper root system in that big pot rather than devoting its energy to pushing out new foliage. Okay, so a lot of times the plants can get overwhelmed if you put them in too big of a pot and they just can never develop a strong enough root system. So you're going to end up with like a really weak plant, a plant that's just not happy. We kind of call this transplant shock if you put something in a pot that's too big, or if you repot it during the wrong time of year, kind of too early when it's still winter. Things can just go into transplant shock. Okay, so we want the plant to be in an appropriate size pot, just 1 or 2 inches in diameter larger than it previously was. That way it's not spending all of its energy building that new root system, and it's actually going to start spitting out some pretty new leaves and foliage for you. Okay, if your pot has a drainage hole in the bottom, you can go ahead and pot that plant directly in that pot. We just want it to have good drainage. Okay, if you don't have a drainage hole, my favorite thing to do, you can see this pot, no hole at the bottom. Okay, we call this method the cash pot method. So you can see I've still got this plant in the little ugly plastic nursery pot that it comes in. I'm just going to take it and I'm just going to sit it down inside this pot that doesn't have a drainage hole. And now it looks like it's potted in there, but it's not. It's totally fine. So I can still take it out to water, get good drainage, and then just pop it back inside this cover pot, basically. And it looks pretty. By no means do you have to have a cover pot. People just like that for aesthetic, decor needs. But a plastic nursery pot does the trick just fine. And you're going to make sure that you still get adequate drainage for your plant that way. So love that. But always stick it inside of a decorative pot if you want to. Okay, as far as fertilizing goes, fertilizing isn't totally necessary if you are repotting your plants every couple of years, because most commercial potting mixes are going to have some long-term, slow release fertilizing pellets in the soil, or it may have some kind of organic fertilizer in it, like a bat guano or something like that. All totally fine. So if you're a chronic, repotter, and you're repotting every 1 to 2 years, it's really, you totally don't have to fertilize your plants. This is not something that I've always done. I kind of just started adding a little bit of fertilizer when I got really into plants and I was just wanting to see them grow more and more and more. So you will definitely notice a lot more growth with your plants if you're fertilizing, but it's not necessary. So don't feel overwhelmed. Don't feel like you have to do that. I am a very low maintenance plant person. I typically water my plants every 10 to 14 days when I think about it. And so my plants have to be low maintenance. So I'm really not much of a fertilizer. But I'm going to tell you what to look out for in the event that you do want to fertilize your plants. It's very simple, but it can be very confusing when you're at the store and you're like, holy cow, there are so many fertilizers on the market, all for different plants. What in the world do I use? Where do I start? So I'm going to help you with that very basic level. You only want to fertilize your plants when they are actively growing. So again, spring and summer. During that dormancy period in the fall and winter, you're probably just going to burn your plants to death if you are fertilizing them during that time, because again, they're kind of just in that sleeping phase. They don't really need a whole lot of extra stuff. They don't need much water. They certainly don't need fertilizer because they're not going to grow this time of year. So now, as we're getting ready for spring, now is the time to start reintroducing fertilizer if you would like to. I typically prefer to use a more organic type of plant food, as they call it now, instead of a synthetic, chemical based, highly concentrated fertilizer, because you have a lower risk of burning the plant. And I'll kind of go over some of that with you guys. Typically, you really only have to fertilize 1 to 2 times per month during spring and summer. And there's a lot of different stuff on the market. So like this is a type of plant food fertilizer that you actually just shake down into the soil, and it's activated by water. So you're going to shake this around the top of the soil, and then when you water your plant just like normal, that is going to slowly release this fertilizer down into the root system. So there's stuff like this. There's also liquid fertilizers where you're actually going to mix this in with your water that you're going to use to water the plant. So you fill up your watering pitcher, you drop a few drops of your fertilizer in the watering pitcher, and then every single plant that you water around your house is going to get that liquid gold. Okay. So lots of different stuff. There's not one that's better than the other per se. But I am going to talk to you guys about the NPK ratio. Don't just stick with me here. I promise this is not anything too intense, but you're going to notice this when you buy fertilizers, the NPK ratio. So what is this? The N stands for nitrogen, the P stands for phosphorus, the K stands for potassium. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are the main macronutrients that your plants need to survive. And a lot of your commercial potting mixes are already going to have this in there, like I said, so it's fine. If you don't want to fertilize your plants separately, just repot every couple of years and you'll be fine. But you're going to notice when you buy fertilizers, you can see down here in this photo where I've got the red box, every bottle of fertilizer is going to have 3 numbers, okay? The NPK ratio, the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium. So as you can see down here, this one has 10% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 3% potassium. So that's going to look like a 10-4-3 on the label, okay? That is your NPK ratio. Now, what does all this mean? Why do we care? Let me tell you. This is what you're looking for, okay? For houseplants, we're not dealing with any fruit. We're really not dealing with any flowers. That's more for the outside plants, okay? So for indoor plants, we're dealing with foliage. We want something that's going to produce pretty leaves and foliage, okay? That is your nitrogen. Nitrogen is the most important element for houseplants. So you're always going to notice on your indoor plant fertilizers, that nitrogen number is going to be higher. So again, this 10-4-3 in the example I'm using, the 10 is the nitrogen. This is a true houseplant fertilizer, okay? The phosphorus is more for flowering and fruiting and outdoor plants. So for your outdoor plants, you'll want that middle number, that phosphorus number to be higher, okay? And then potassium is just important for all plants. We need it for their overall root development, normal functioning of the plant. So that's always going to be in there regardless of if you're doing indoor plants, outdoor plants, whatever. So for example, on this one that I showed you guys a minute ago that you just kind of sprinkle around the soil, the NPK ratio is on the back of this one, and it says 6-4-3. So again, the 6 is the highest because we're dealing with houseplants. We want that nitrogen number to be the highest. So always look for your NPK ratio before you buy fertilizer. You want that nitrogen number to be the highest, that first number to be the highest if you're dealing with houseplants. All right, that's just basic stuff. I'm not going to go too far into that because you can imagine it can get really, really, really overwhelming and just too much, okay? And then let's talk about watering. So how often are you going to water now? It kind of depends on your plant, totally. I always say, when in doubt, let it dry out before you overwater things. Overwatering is the easiest way to kill your houseplants. I know most people are afraid that they're going to forget about them and they're going to underwater, but overwatering is so much harder to deal with because when you overwater your plants, it's really hard to come back from that, okay? So I always recommend that everyone have a moisture meter. These are super, super cheap. You can get them at Lowe's, Home Depot, Amazon. I used to sell them in my shop, so there may be some local houseplant shops that have them as well. But this is just a little meter, a little probe, okay? And you can tell it's nice and long. So this is great for even your larger plants. It can get all the way down to the bottom of that root system so that you can see how wet or dry your soil is. Do I need to water? Do I not? Okay. So if you'll notice, once you stick this down in the soil, this little probe is going to go from dry to wet, okay? So if it goes to wet, that is your cue to hold off on watering for a little bit longer. Okay. There certainly are some plants that don't like to dry out all the way. So I would just recommend doing some research on your particular plant before you start watering it, so that you'll know kind of what regimen you need to be on. But when in doubt, let it dry out. Don't overwater, especially if your plant doesn't have a drainage hole. It's going to hold more water than you think. So get a moisture meter, stick it down in the soil, look at your meter, dry, wet. Okay, I'm good to water. So I would say as we move into spring and summer, the days are going to start getting longer. The sun's going to be hotter. Things are going to dry out a lot more quickly than they do in the winter months. So you may go from watering every 14 days to every 7 to 10 days. So just keep an eye on it. I usually check my plants weekly just to make sure that they're getting what they need, especially when the seasons start to change like this. That way you're not neglecting anything. But I certainly understand that things get busy and our plants get neglected. It happens to the best of us. So those are kind of my tips for, repotting everything, watering, fertilizing, all that jazz. Again, tried to be really quick because I don't want to hold you guys up for too long. So I'm going to go ahead and take questions. All of my information is here. If you guys need to get in touch for any projects or anything like that, feel free.
And I am dropping that email right now in the chat, as well as that phone number. If you do have questions, we have time for questions. So toss those in the chat as well. We already have some coming in, Caitlin. Great information. And we're going to start from kind of the top here.
Okay.
Is it too late to put my dead Christmas flowers to get them reblooming for next year? Have they already missed the boat?
I would say now if the plant is dead, don't worry. A lot of times you can go ahead and just prune back, just cut back, just to the bare stems. It's going to be ugly. I know your plant is not going to look like a plant. It's just going to look like a pot with bare stems, but that's the best way to encourage regrowths on like your poinsettias and things like that. Go ahead and just cut them as far back as you can. Just leave a few stems in the pot, water it like you normally would. You can even stick it outside. Poinsettias do well with some nice like indirect outside light, especially with our humidity in Alabama. So I would give it a try. I mean, especially if you think the plant's already dead anyway. I love a project like this. So just try it and see. You'll never know unless you try.
Is it possible to grow vegetables inside of an apartment? I know you used to live in a loft, and that's kind of what got you started into this whole endeavor. Mm-hmm. But is it possible to grow veggies inside of an apartment? Does it have to be outdoors?
So when we talk about vegetables and when we talk about herbs and things like that, usually they're going to have to be grown outdoors simply because they need so much light, okay? Really high light requirements, direct sunlight. Now, all of that to say, there are certainly a lot of companies that I'm seeing nowadays that are offering these in-home gardens. A lot of times they come with like a tower. They come on a tower with grow lights. So if you can use some supplemental grow lights indoors, that's going to be a lot better for trying to grow vegetables, herbs, things like that. We just don't typically get enough sunlight indoors, which is also why our plants don't typically flower indoors. Something like a bird of paradise, right? You see these big, beautiful birds of paradise in Florida and California and places like that. They can live outdoors and they bloom. They bloom these beautiful flowers. Indoors, I've never seen one bloom. We just don't get enough sunlight for it. So if you're going to try to grow, things like that in an apartment, if you want things to bloom or fruit or grow vegetables or herbs, I would definitely incorporate some supplemental grow lights. And that's probably going to give you the best chance of success there.
Somebody gave one of our attendees an orchid, and it's very root bound. And they're wondering, what your repotting advice, does it apply to orchids as well?
So there are some plants that really enjoy being root bound, and these are going to be, again, I tried not to go like too plant nerd into this presentation because I could talk about this for hours. But plants that do enjoy being root bound are called epiphytes. Epiphytes are your plants that typically grow onto other plants in nature. Orchids are one of those. So orchids, if you ever see an orchid in nature, they usually grow on the sides of trees. They attach to the tree bark, which is why you pot them in like an orchid bark mixture. Typically, they love bark. So Orchids are one of those that love being root bound. So you can absolutely repot it if you feel like it's ready, in a nice barky, chunky, orchid mixture. But you can also leave it and just kind of see how it does for a little while, because orchids do enjoy being really root bound.
How does air quality affect indoor plants?
It's kind of actually the opposite. Your indoor plants will affect your air quality. So if you and I don't want you guys to think, oh, she's crazy. I'm just going to put one plant in my house and it's going to make the air quality better. Not necessarily. If you group a lot of plants together in one part of your house, it will definitely help filter, impurities out of the air, help with your air quality for sure. NASA has done several big studies on this, which I find very interesting. So yeah, if you are worried about air quality in your house, a lot of our appliances and stuff nowadays, they really emit a lot of different substances, formaldehydes and things like that. So there are definitely plants that are great with helping filter impurities out of the air inside of your home. So I joke with my husband, because it took each of us like the better part of a year and a half to get COVID for the first time. And I was like, oh, we're fine. We've got the best air quality in Alabama in this house with all of these plants in here. So that's why we haven't gotten COVID yet, totally kidding.
What type of sand should somebody look at?
So there is a such thing as horticultural sand, which is probably the safest to go with. A lot of times, like playground sand, like you can buy in bulk from Home Depot and Lowe's, a lot of times that will already come with some like dyes and stuff in it just to make it white. So sometimes that stuff is pre-treated, and it's not always best to mix in with the roots of your plants and the soil and things like that. It can kind of make your plants sad. So look for like a horticultural sand, or if you can find something out in nature, even just some kind of rocky sand. Every time we're at the beach, I'm like, God, if I could just bottle this up and take it back with me, this is exactly what I need, but look for a horticultural sand if you're just buying something commercially.
Somebody makes their own compost at home with vegetable waste using a food cycler. How often can they use those as fertilizer?
I would say do it once a month, see how your plants respond. That's a very organic way to fertilize your plants, which should be safe for sure. I love that so much more than buying these heavy, chemical fertilizers from the store. So start with once a month, and that may be plenty. If your plants are tolerating it really well, you could even do it twice a month. Just see how they do.
So I'm going to butcher this one. I'm just telling you right now, Joyce. What do you want for flowering indoor plants such as Kalanchoe or orchids?
Kalanchoe and orchids.
There you go.
Yes. Okay, sorry. So say the first part of that question again.
What do you want for flowering them?
For flowering them, you would just want you would want a lot of sunlight, so put them near a very bright window. And I will talk briefly just about the cardinal directions of your windows. So we've got north, south, east, and west, right? So with the direction the sun's moving every day, your north-facing windows just are not going to get much sunlight throughout the day. It's just a fact. Okay, you can watch your own home and kind of use your compass on your phone and say, okay, these are my north-facing windows. She's right; they're not getting very much sun. So your east-facing windows are going to get a lot of morning sun when the sun's rising. Your south and your west-facing windows are going to get bombarded with tons of direct sunlight throughout the day and the afternoon, very hot sun, okay, especially in the summer. So when you're talking about which window, which part of my house should I put these plants so that they'll bloom the best, put them in a south or a west facing window, very close to the window if you want it to bloom. Do be careful, because sometimes that direct sunlight can cause some burning to the foliage, but on plants like kalanchoe, other succulents, things like that, they'll love it. They'll be so happy. So put them near a bright window, either south or west facing windows, and then look for a fertilizer that has a little bit more of that phosphorus content that's going to help with the flowering of the plant. So just that NPK, going back to that NPK ratio, the phosphorus is great for blooming, that middle number.
And usually when I'm doing webinars with medical terminology, that's what I butcher, not kalanchoe. So I apologize for that.
You're doing great.
These aren't green. I'm just going to tell you right now. Please talk about orchid care. This person has one that hasn't bloomed after the original blooms dropped off. What do they need to do?
Yes, so a lot of people struggle with this, me included. I'm not great with the blooming stuff. I'm more of a heavy foliage person. So with orchids, again, they do love to be root bound. A lot of people do the whole like ice cube to water the plant thing. I stick it under there, let it get good and thoroughly watered, and then I let it dry completely out. So that's the other thing with the epiphytes, the plants that I was talking about that like to be root bound and typically grow onto other trees and things. Orchids, they love to dry completely out. They're used to having to like seep moisture from that tree, from that host that they're growing on. So don't overwater it. That's going to be key. Let it completely dry out before you water again. And with the flowers, I typically will just cut back as much of the bud and kind of the stem. If any of the stem looks dead, cut as much of that back as you can and just give it a fresh start. Give it really bright light, again, near a window that's going to get, nice sunlight throughout the day. And try watering. If you can't get it to rebloom, try watering with one of those high, phosphorus fertilizers and see if that helps at all.
Peat moss, good to use?
So peat moss is kind of interesting. Like a lot of people are moving away from peat moss because it's not sustainable, but peat moss is in everything. Peat moss is in, it's very moisture retaining. That's the other thing. So for some plants like your ferns and calatheas and things that really like to stay wet, peat moss is great. Peat moss is usually going to come in your base soil mixtures. Like if you look at the ingredients on your Miracle-Gro, it's going to be mostly peat moss, which is why I will buy that as a base mix. And then I'll kind of mix in some other soil amendments, your perlite, your bark, things like that, sand, things like that with it. So you're usually going to get peat moss regardless, in your base potting mix as well.
This person has a peace plant that they can't get to bloom to open. What should they do?
So more sunlight. The peace lilies do great with low light. They're just not going to bloom with low light. So move it closer to a window, and then try fertilizing with something with like a little bit more phosphorus in it. And I think that should do the trick.
This person has a fairly large Christmas cactus and wonders if they need to get just a much bigger pot or they can divide it. So if they can divide it, any tips? If they shouldn't, should they just get a wider or deeper pot?
Absolutely. You could do either. You can split it. Now, when Christmas cacti, really any plant, when they get old and they've been in the same pot and the roots are well established, they can be very hard to separate. So they actually make like a root ball knife that they sell, at hardware stores, Lowe's, Home Depot, all that stuff. So you actually use that knife to kind of cut the plant, the root ball where you want to cut it at and separate it more easily. Christmas cacti are very hardy. So you could either go up in pot size or you could try to split that into a few plants actually. And they make great gifts for family. I love to give Christmas cactuses. I feel like everyone has like their grandma's old Christmas cactus that's just an incredibly impressive specimen. And I always want one of a while to grow and get that impressive. And so if you've got one that you've had forever, or maybe it was passed down through the family, like, maybe keep it in the same pot and just see how big it can get. Or if you want to split it up, give it to family. And it's a nice little hand-me-down. I love those.
If you have a snake plant and part of it has died, should you repot it into a smaller pot?
Absolutely. You'll find when you go to separate a snake plant, you're not going to need any kind of a root knife or anything because it's just going to kind of separate usually, because all of those little snake plants, leaves are kind of their own little separate thing typically. So once you take it out of the pot and you prune away any of the dead parts, just kind of see what you're left with. And if you need to send that down into a smaller pot size just to kind of regroup and reestablish its roots, that is totally fine. I'm not usually a proponent for like cramming, a big plant into a small pot, but sometimes you need to do that. If you've got a plant and part of it dies, sometimes you do need to backtrack and go back down into a smaller pot just so that it can establish some good new healthy roots. That's totally fine.
Any advice on revival for ferns?
Oh gosh, ferns, the bane of my existence. So you could certainly try to cut them back as much as possible. Again, like start just from the basics with those just little twigs of the plant sticking up out of the dirt and keep it nice and moist. Ferns, once they get dry and crispy, Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of coming back. So I would just try to prune it, try to cut it back as much as you possibly can to kind of the level of the dirt, and just keep watering it. It doesn't have to have a ton of sunlight, just some good bright indirect light so it doesn't get burned, and just see if it'll make a comeback. It's
Monica
burns
succulents.
are always a project piece.
Monica succulents keep dying. What's the best method to maintain them?
So typically people overwater succulents. Think about them as desert plants, drought tolerant plants that do not need you or your water really ever. Okay. I promise if you will just forget about your succulents, they will thrive. Try watering them once every month to 6 weeks and see how they do. You can always add more water if you feel like they're dry and crispy and they're dying, because they're getting maybe too much sun and not enough water. You can always add more water, but make sure they're getting really bright sunlight. South or west facing window is going to be best because that's going to mimic their natural environment. Harsh, dry sunlight, right? Not a lot of humidity in the desert, things like that. So yeah, cut back on your watering. Water very, very not very often at all. So every 4 to 6 weeks, and give them a lot of sunlight. And that's going to be your succulents' best chance for survival. Just forget about them.
Another orchid question. This person's, Claudia says, hers hasn't bloomed since the original blooms and is now developing long roots that reach out.
Yes. Okay. So those roots, those are called your aerial roots. That is what you're going to see on those epiphytic plants. They are literally reaching out, trying to grab onto a host, like a tree or something. So that's what those are, those aerial roots. They do not have to be potted in dirt. The aerial roots do not. They're going to be fine. You can clip them. You can leave them. You could even give it a little moss pole to grow up if you wanted to, and it would actually attach to that moss pole and keep growing. So again, with the orchids, yeah, give them good bright light, and just try fertilizing with some kind of fertilizer that has a high phosphorus content, and that's going to help with the reblooming.
Donna asks how you would classify a Christmas cactus, tropical or desert, because the plant that she has is not blooming and the other is just having minimal blooms.
Okay. I would definitely characterize it based on its watering needs. I would characterize it as a desert plant. Christmas cacti are also interesting, and aloe does this too. When they are super, super thirsty, the tips of the plant will actually turn like a pinkish purple color. Mine is doing it right now, but it's all the way across the room, so I'm not gonna take my computer over there and show you guys. But that's kind of how you know when your Christmas cactus is really, really thirsty. Look at the tips of it, like the last few little leaves, and they're gonna be like a pinkish purple color, and that's just kind of the plant. It's literally leaching all of the moisture that it can out of those leaves. And so if you're seeing that, maybe time to repot or just give it a really nice soaking with water, and then you can let it dry out again and before you water it again.
What kind of weather do you look for before you feel it is safe to bring your houseplants outdoors for the summer?
Yeah. Typically, I like to say once the temperature's staying above 55 degrees on a regular basis, that's nighttime temperatures too. Okay. Because at night things can kind of drop, a little bit beneath that, and then your plants get unhappy. So once the temperatures are consistently staying above 55 degrees, you're going to be fine. I know that that's nowhere near freezing, and most people are like, oh, I thought we just had to worry about the plants freezing. But with your tropical plants, they get very unhappy. These things are used to growing in Florida, right? Where the humidity is just crazy, and they get great sunlight all day, and the temperature is warm. So if these plants get below 50 degrees, 55 degrees, they're not going to do so hot. So once the temps are sustainable, staying up morning and night, you can go ahead and take some stuff back outside.
Sally's not having much luck. She wants to know the easiest house plant to take care of.
Okay. Two that I always recommend that people start with are a snake plant, Sansevieria, that's the fancy name for it, but a snake plant, or a ZZ plant. Okay. The ZZ plant has a name this long that has 2 Z's in it, and that's why everybody calls it a ZZ plant, but everyone knows it as a ZZ plant. So if you go to Lowe's and Home Depot, they will have these plants. I love both of these because you can water them. You can get by with watering them about once a month. And they can do bright light or low light, so you don't have to worry about where you're putting it in your house. So I always tell people, start with a snake plant, start with a ZZ plant. If you can keep those alive, I'm one of those people. I believe anybody can have a green thumb. It's really just kind of doing your research and knowing what the plant wants, right? What kind of light, what kind of water. Those are your basics. So once you can master that and you can remember to water this plant once a month, when you pay your bills, when you pay your mortgage at the beginning of the month, water that plant. That's kind of a good schedule to get on. So ZZ plant, snake plant, those are going to be the two that I would recommend starting with.
Jennifer wants to know if there's any recommendations for getting rid of gnats in your house plants.
Yes, gnats are awful. They are a result of overwatering. So again, that's kind of why I said, when in doubt, let it dry out, because you do not want to deal with fungus gnats from overwatering. So a couple of things, there's like a multi-level approach to dealing with fungus gnats, but everybody has to do it at some point because you're bound to get them. So first and foremost, you want to buy some yellow sticky traps from Amazon. Okay. They are just little basically stickers. They're yellow that you stick down in the soil. The gnats are attracted to the yellow color, so they stick to it and it catches them. It's just a little gnat trap, basically a little sticky trap. Okay. So that's what you're going to do to catch the adults that are flying around your soil. Okay. You're going to put a yellow sticky trap down in there. Now, once you catch the adults, you also have to kill their eggs, their larvae that they have laid down in that wet soil. Okay. And this is the bad part. To do this, there are a few different products on the market. Number one is something called diatomaceous earth. It is a white powdery substance. Diatomaceous earth literally just has a bunch of little diatoms in it. And if you'll sprinkle that around the top of your soil, it'll kind of suffocate those gnats when they try to hatch and come out of the soil. The diatoms will just rip them to shreds. I know that's kind of graphic, but the diatomaceous earth will kill the gnats, or the larvae of the gnats. You can also buy mosquito bits. Mosquito bits are actually a lot of times for mosquitoes, like in outdoor settings. But you can buy a bag of mosquito bits for your indoor plants. And what I like to do is I just pour some of those mosquito bits in the water that I'm going to water my plants with, and I just let them soak, and I let that mosquito bit, whatever's in there, the chemicals, I'm not really sure, let that kind of diffuse into the water, and then water your plants with it. Because the problem is, if you are having fungus gnats, that usually means your soil is too wet and you need to let it dry out. So a lot of times you kind of have to wait for this drying period before you can water again and use the mosquito bits in there. So let your soil dry out, water with those mosquito bits, and then that will kill the larvae as well. But you've got to kill both. You've got to kill the adults and you've got to kill the larvae. So that's why fungus gnats are just such a pain.
Keena's fiddle leaf fig tree is so fickle, she says. Can you share tips on how to help them grow out instead of just up?
Yes, you can actually, I have seen online where people do this thing called notching, and they will actually take a knife and they will kind of cut a little notch into the stem of the fiddle leaf fig. You can then, like, something that helps to do, it just basically, if you injure a plant at its stem, it kind of encourages that plant to grow or to like repair itself, which usually makes it grow outwards. So cut a little notch in the stem that will promote growth outward. You can also, once you cut that notch, you can take some sphagnum moss and just wet that a little bit and put that in the crevice that you etched out. Just wrap it with a little bit of saran wrap just to keep it in place. So that's just going to keep that branch kind of moist as it's trying to grow and regenerate. And eventually you'll just take that off. Once you see a little like nub starting to grow from that notch, you can take all that off and just treat it like a normal plant. But that definitely will encourage, more growth outward for sure.
How do you fix plants that may have root rot or mold? Can you just pour some fungicide into it and fix it, or do you need to repot the plant to break up the roots?
Typically, I like to just go ahead and repot the plant, just put it in some fresh soil that's nice and dry, nothing that's going to be wet, and let those roots dry out. With mold on the top of a plant, mold isn't necessarily a huge problem. A lot of times fungus and plants work in like a symbiotic relationship. So a lot of times if you have like mushrooms and things growing in your pot, that just means the soil is really healthy. But absolutely, if you've got root rot, you'll be able to smell it. I mean, it smells like the plant is rotten. And typically when you take the plant out of its pot, there's going to be standing water in the bottom of the pot. I cannot tell you how many times that's happened to me. And you don't know it until you take the plant out and you're like, oh my God, this is the problem. That's an easy fix. Just put it in some new soil. It's happy.
Monica's asking, she's talking about African violets. Should she get one of the special pots designed for them?
You absolutely can. I don't have a ton of experience with those, but yes, that will just kind of encourage them to kind of grow outward, and fill all of those little holes in the pots and things and just keep flowering, just as they grow. So I think it's worth doing for sure.
Tamara and let's see here, Karen both asked about low maintenance indoor plants. I think we hit a little bit on that on your favorite easy ones to do.
Yeah. Do the ZZ plants and the snake plants are great. Pothos are also this is a type of pothos, so they're like really viney, so you can really get a nice contrast if you just start with 3 plants: the ZZ plant, the snake plant, and a pothos. The pothos is going to have to be watered a little bit more often than the other 2. But you can still let it completely dry out, and it's going to be very, very forgiving. So those are the 3 I would start with. They all look different, and they give you a nice, kind of array of, you've got the trailing plant, you've got the upright plant, and then the ZZ plant is just kind of, it's got some pretty foliage, but not as upright as the snake plant.
And I'm going to apologize to people. We are going to be winding things down here in a few minutes. I still want to get as many questions in as possible. If I send you the unanswered ones, can you flip back answers?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So we will get all these questions answered. I'm going to skip ahead. We're planting these indoors. Does the AC have effects on houseplants?
Yes. Any kind of draft, cold or warm, like in the wintertime, can certainly have an effect on your plants. So if you may notice that your leaves on your plants are starting to like brown around the edges, or the leaves are cracking. It's just because they're drying out from that draft, whether it's the air, the heat, whatever. And they may kind of start to curl up. So keep an eye on your plants that are near a vent. Basically, they may need to be watered a little bit more often. They may dry out a little bit more quickly. And then you may need a little bit more humidity. Some people like to put a humidifier nearby just to kind of counterbalance, the cold air or the hot air that's blowing on the plant. So, but it's, you may just have to move the plant away from the vent if it's a problem.
Lisa doesn't get direct sunlight into her home at all. She's on a valley. What plants would you suggest for that?
There are tons. Okay, so honestly, most houseplants prefer that indirect light. So the only plants that really want direct hot sunlight are going to be like your cacti, your succulents, some of your Hoyas, things like that. The really waxy, drought tolerant plants. Okay, everything else, the more tropical stuff, it can kind of be back away from the windows a little bit, or near your windows if you don't get a ton of direct sunlight. That's how my house is. I've got trees all around us. So even though I have a ton of windows, I don't get a lot of direct sunlight, and it's fine. I promise you can still have plants. So most house plants are going to want that good indirect, or kind of medium low light.
What is the best care for an aloe plant?
Aloe, really, really bright sunlight, direct sunlight, even put it outside if you can in the summer. And then let it completely dry out. Treat it like a desert plant.
This is the last question I'm going to take, and it's from Claudia, and then we'll send the rest to you. We'll flip them around, and we'll send out a follow-up email with all that information, as well as a link to the replay. Claudia asks, any recommendations around plant safety for toddlers?
Yes. So I tend to, when I had my plant shop, we always had people coming in asking for like pet safe plants and kid safe plants. And there are certainly plenty out there that, let's say your toddler were to take a bite. I mean, kids do things like this, right? Say your toddler were to take a bite out of one of the leaves or the stems. There are a lot of safe plants out there. Your ferns are going to be non-toxic. Calatheas are non-toxic. Phetonias are non-toxic. A lot of things. You can do a quick Google search of plants that are non-toxic to kids, pets, whatever. But as far as, safety goes, I think just teaching the kid from a young age, that's like, hey, we're gentle, we treat the plant, like a person or like a pet, you can't be rough with it. Just kind of teach them like that. We don't eat that. That doesn't go in our mouth kind of thing. Kids are curious and they're going to get into stuff. Pets do the same thing. But maybe just try to stick with the non-toxic plants. That way you don't have anything to worry about if they do get into it.
Caitlin, Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and guiding us through spring house plants.
Yes, I'm so happy to do it. Thank you guys for having me and for like asking questions and being involved. And like I said, if you have any plant projects or, want to come over and do an in-home consultation just to take a look at what you've got and what needs to be repotted and things like that, I can absolutely do that too. So I'm happy to help with any plant needs that you have.
And thank you again so much. And just a reminder to everybody in the audience, an apology for not getting to all the questions. We could have run on all day. A recording of today's webinar will be uploaded on our website by tomorrow. As an attendee, you'll get an email with a replay link, and we'll also get those questions over to Caitlin so we can get those answered as well. In a moment, I'll let you know what webinars we have coming up for you to watch and an opportunity for you to let us know how we're doing. First, I'd like to invite you to take part in the 17th annual scholarship run presented by Viva Health. This year's run is on April 15th, starting at 8 a.m. We have a 5K, 10K, and virtual option. Come out and support student scholarships by joining us at the Battery in Homewood or virtually wherever you may be running. Register at alumni.uab.edu/5K, 10K. And here's a look at some upcoming webinars. On Tuesday, March 21st, come back for I Believe There is a Hero in All of Us, Superheroes and Risk-Taking Behavior in Young Children. Dr. David Schwebel and KSC Martin will tell us why today's superhero culture could negatively affect our children. On Tuesday, April 4th, Dr. Doug Mollering will present Healthy Eating Meets Healthy Activity for Busy Families, where we'll figure out how families on the go can maintain balance in their lives. On Thursday, April 13th, we'll begin a series aimed at parents of youth athletes. The first of the 5-part series will feature Dr. Kelvin Spellman with Burnout in Youth Sports, Why Specialization is Not So Special. And on Thursday, May 4th, join us for Mischief Managed, the way in which Harry Potter transfixed a generation. 2 Potterheads, Ebony Harris and Jen Ivey, will explore the Potterverse, including Harry, his friends, and Dumbledore. You can register for all these and take a look at a lot more that we have coming up at alumni.uab.edu/events. And before you go, let us know how we're going. What did you think about today's webinar? What do you would like to see in the future? The QR code on your screen takes you to a short survey. Please take a moment or two to complete it. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Caitlin, for being here. And as always, go Blazers.